Much like the civil rights movement of the 1950s, parents and other interested groups pushed for legislation that would give persons with disabilities the same rights as their non-disabled peers. These rights included access to services and a free and appropriate education. Congress first addressed the education of students with disabilities in 1966 when it amended the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 to establish a grant program to assist states in the initiation, expansion, and improvement of programs and projects for the education of handicapped children. In 1970, that program was replaced by the Education of the Handicapped Act. Neither program included any specific mandates on the use of the funds provided by the grants. In 1972, Congress launched an investigation into the status of children with disabilities and found that millions of children were not receiving an appropriate education. At the same time, discrimination existed not only in education, but also in employment, housing, transportation, access to public buildings, access to equal medical care, and in many other areas. In 1973, the first federal civil rights protection for people with disabilities, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, was signed into law. Section 504 was based on the language of previous civil rights laws that protected women and minorities, and it said, no program receiving federal funds could discriminate against a person with a disability. On November 19, 1975, Congress went further and enacted the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, later changed to Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. It intended that all children with disabilities would have a right to education and to establish a process by which state and local educational agencies may be held accountable for providing educational services for all handicapped children. While America has made great strides in educating and opening the doors of opportunity for children with disabilities, we have not been able to properly address the growing cultural gap in achievement. It is true that having more access to special services has greatly helped society in many ways. It may be argued that the growing use of special education has held back some of the very same groups of people that fought so hard for their rights in the first place. In 1975, when Congress enacted the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, it also found that poor African American children were overrepresented in special education, and this trend continues today. In the findings of IDEA 2004, Congress described ongoing problems with the over-identification of minority children, including mislabeling and high dropout rates. Everyone involved in education is aware of the issue of racial achievement gaps in standardized test scores, but some are now seeing the bigger spotlight on our schools' difficulties in effectively teaching struggling minority students. Overrepresentation of African American, Hispanic, and Native American students in special education has become the trend in America's public schools. Federal data from 2007 show that African American students made up 17% of the U.S. school enrollment, but more than 20% of the students classified with specific learning disabilities. Likewise, Hispanic students represented just over 20% of the school population, but almost 24% of students classified with learning disabilities. Associate Professor of Education at Vanderbilt University and author H. Richard Milner IV says, the data are clear that when you look at the representation of minorities in special education, there's something going on behind the scenes. In other words, there are kids who are placed in these programs because educators either don't want to deal with them, don't know how to deal with them, or don't know how to be responsive to them. Researchers point out that placement in special education can often make matters worse for these students. These students tend to have poorer academic and career outcomes than their peers, including much higher high school dropout rates. Compounding the problem is the enduring stigma that the special education label can have on students who don't belong there. With growing population of African Americans and Hispanics, the disparity in education must be addressed. In an article in Education Week, author Anthony Rebora makes many suggestions. He argues that schools need to open up the conversation about racial disparity. Schools should foster honest, though tactful, discussions on issues of race and academic achievement. Teachers and staff must examine their own, mostly subtle, biases and misunderstandings or lack of knowledge of other cultures. Educators must explore their personal perspectives and worldviews as well as their practices and curriculum. School leaders may need to scrutinize the curriculum for areas that exclude or fail to resonate with particular subgroups of students. For example, math story problems may be remote from some kids' experience. To tap students' full capacity, curriculum needs to be accepting, interesting, motivating to kids, and to make connections between academic content and their lives. To minimize the potential for added referrals, experts advise school leaders should ensure that teachers receive sustained training in high-frequency problem areas like classroom management, English language learner instruction, literacy development, differentiation, and culturally responsive practice. Perhaps more crucially, schools detecting signs of disproportionality should introduce rigorous academic interventions in the form of individual or small group instruction to provide added support for students who are at risk of falling behind. There is at least some isolated evidence that the response to intervention model, or RTI, can significantly reduce special education referrals for minority students. Finally, Rebora suggests teachers discipline wisely. Disciplinary problems are often a prominent factor in minority special education referrals. Teachers should try to understand the motivation behind the behavior before punishing the student or removing him or her from the class. As a rule, experts stress, teachers shouldn't make assumptions about a student on the basis of behavioral issues. We're all responding from our own cultural frameworks of what we expect behaviors to look like in the classroom, and not every kid comes with the same framework or same set of problem-solving skills. Classroom teachers have great influence over special education referrals and placements. All efforts, including professional development and data-driven RTI, must be exhausted before making any referral to special education. There are so many children that truly do benefit from the services and programs that special education provides. Let's not waste the valuable resources and expertise trying to, quote, fix the kids that we have not been able to connect with in regular classrooms. Section 504 of ADA and IDEA were designed to protect the rights of individuals with disabilities. Let us not forget that minorities without disabilities also have the right not to be placed in special education simply because of discriminatory or biased curriculum, teacher perceptions and attitudes, or evaluations and assessments that are not culturally responsive.